All right, great. Welcome to another monthly program of the Rhinebeck Historical Society. This evening, I'm really delighted to be able, actually we have here in the audience, he's not standing up here in front, but Mike DiGiacomo, who's the president of the old Rhinebeck Aerodrome. And Mike, I understand, is a business owner here in Rhinebeck, runs Mike's Tree Service, and has been a fan of aviation since his youth. And actually standing next to me is a person who's been a fan of aviation since, how many weeks old were you when you stepped into that airplane?
I was 5 weeks old when my parents took me flying at the old Rhinebeck Aerodrome.
Okay. His mom and dad worked for, I have a feeling we're going to hear about Cole Palen tonight, so I don't want to steal any of your thunder. But Mike, later in life, went into the aviation business, is a licensed pilot, has done a lot of flying, actually sells airplanes. If you know anybody who's interested in buying a Cessna tomorrow or even tonight, he can hook you up.
We can make that happen.
But seriously, the old Rhinebeck Aerodrome is an important fixture here in, well, we say it's Rhinebeck, it's actually over the line in Red Hook, except for, I understand, a portion of the airfield.
That's correct.
But we need to hear the story from you. So we're delighted to have you here and look forward to the story.
Well, thank you very much. We're happy to be here and happy to tell everyone start to finish where we are at the aerodrome. Again, my name's Clay Hammond. I'm a chief pilot and vice president of the board of trustees at the old Rhinebeck Aerodrome. And Mike DiGiacomo's here with me tonight to kind of play off each other. So he might talk some, I'll talk some. I've been there since the start. My parents were employees at the aerodrome in the 80s, and I was born here in Rhinebeck. And we moved away when I was 10 years old and back to the south where my parents were from, and I've since moved back about 2 years ago and now live and work here in the valley full time and spend all of my off time at the aerodrome helping out there. So we'll start at the beginning. 1958, Cole Palen purchased the property there at the intersection of Stone Church and Norton Road. It was an abandoned farm that he purchased for back taxes. The farm had been abandoned after an unsolved murder had taken place there on the property. It had languished for some period of time, and he bought it as quite the deal with the express purpose of turning it into what would become the old Rhinebeck Aerodrome. Cole, previous to purchasing the property, had purchased at auction 6 aircraft from a museum out on Long Island at what used to be known as Roosevelt Field. Roosevelt Field was a famous airfield there on Long Island. It's where Charles Lindbergh had launched from for his transatlantic flight. It's where a number of eventful flights and test flights had taken place. It was eventually paved over to make way for a shopping mall. Along with various other developments. Hofstra University is actually located on a portion, on a corner of the old Roosevelt Field Airport out there on Long Island. So the old airfield there at Roosevelt Field had a museum, a small one-hangar museum on it, where they had a number of antique World War I aircraft on display. Not really kept up well, just airplanes that were essentially put in a building and left to atrophy over time. And when the development was about to start for the new shopping center, the new mall that was being built, they elected to auction off that collection of aircraft. Cole was, fresh out of the Army. He had served with the U.S. Army, and he had used his GI Bill to become an aircraft mechanic, and we'll get more into his backstory as we go along the way, but he was familiar with these aircraft at Roosevelt Field. He had seen them, and he had, I think, probably lusted over them a little bit and wished that they could be his, and he ended up pouring his life savings into 2 bids for those 6 aircraft, and lo and behold, he won the entire lot, and he had 6 airplanes, which I can't rattle off the top of my head, but it was an original SPAD,
Right.
an original J1 Standard,
Yep. Southwest Snipe.
an original Southwest Snipe, Newport 28.
No.
No, that
I
came
traded
later.
that later. The Air Marine 39B.
Okay.
Canuck.
Yeah.
And I forgot the other. Avro 504.
And an Avro 504K, that's right. He won those airplanes, and he originally brought them back to his home in Red Oaks Mill, which is just outside of Poughkeepsie. He had an old farm that he lived on with his parents, and he put the airplanes in a chicken coop and promptly started to restore them back to flying condition. Now, this was mid-1950s.
51, I think.
51, 52. So, the airplanes at that time were only 30, 35 years old. So they weren't that old, all things considered. But at the time, no one was preserving these old airplanes. Cole saw diamonds in the rough when he saw those airplanes, and he wanted to see them fly again. He wanted to experience what it was like to fly those old airplanes. And so he commenced to restore the aircraft, and let's go to the next one. He commenced to restore these aircraft and get them flying again. The first airplane that he flew, we'll see a slide later on and I'll point it out, was the SPAD 13. It was an original aircraft from the war, used as a frontline fighter in World War I, and it was brought back to the States and was on display there at the museum until Cole purchased the collection. And he got that airplane flying again. He flew it for 40 years almost before he eventually donated the aircraft to the U.S. Air Force Museum in
Used to fly it all over northeast,
Right, Dayton.
Pennsylvania.
Yep.
and
Wow.
all over the place.
Let's go to the next slide. You can see this is the nose of the SPAD 13 that he purchased. This is the
Newport 28.
that's the Newport 28 that he acquired later on, and the tail here with the polka dots is essentially a modified Fokker D7 that he used to start his early air shows with. He was very much a doer. He was an extraordinary man. He was one of these men who could do a lot with very little, and he essentially had a fleet of airplanes at that point, and he needed a place to fly them. So going back to you don't have to go back, but he ended up purchasing the farm there at Stone Church and Norton Roads with the idea of hacking out a runway so that he could keep his airplanes there. His original goal for the aerodrome, and one that we've continued over the years, was to have a place to fly these airplanes, and for other people to be able to come fly their airplanes. He wanted to make essentially an old-time airport out of this farm so that he could relive his memories of aviation from his youth, and it eventually morphed into a way for other people to relive their memories of aviation in their youth, and that has eventually morphed into it becoming a museum and an air show over the years, so that today we have the museum, which holds upwards of 60 antique and vintage aircraft on display, both in static displays and actively airworthy airplanes that we fly every weekend in the air shows. So let's bounce forward there. This is the old farmhouse. This is the original farmhouse before the fire, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But this is Cole restoring his Curtiss Jenny, an original 1918 Curtiss Jenny. This is a picture of it going into the house in the fall, and then a picture of it coming back out the same window in the spring. Cole at the time was a bachelor.
I was going to say, he didn't have a wife.
He did not have a wife yet. He would work on the airplanes in his home over the winter, and he was a doer. Whatever he put his mind to, he essentially accomplished. And this was an original 1918. That's a Jenny, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Curtiss Jenny, J&4 Jenny, that still flies at the aerodrome today, and we'll see pictures of it later on. Go to the next one. This is him in the living room of the house, essentially doping the wings. If we take a sidebar real quick, these airplanes that we fly are what we call old rag and tube airplanes, meaning they have wooden or metal structures over which a covering of fabric is applied to give the airplane its aerodynamic shape, both for the fuselage and for the wings. So they've applied fabric over the wings here, and now they are essentially, they've stitched the airplane, or stitched the fabric to the wings to give it a mechanical bond, and now they're applying a cellulose-based sealant, which is called, they call it dope in in aviation circles, to seal the fabric and to make it non-permeable, so that it's watertight, and also to ward off UV degradation from the sunlight. So it's a very smelly process. It uses a lot of solvents and chemicals that are very harsh, and he's doing it in his living room. So that just.
Clay was saying how Cole didn't have a lot of money. What Cole would do is he would go down to One Release Fabric in Kingston and buy drapery fabric, which was extremely heavy and not very good for the purpose, but it was cheap.
Yeah.
And he would use that and cover his airplanes with that. And up until just 20 years ago, there was still a couple of planes the Aerodrome cover that. Super strong, worked really well, but it was kind of heavy.
Well, we, we'll show pictures later on of one of our latest restorations, which was the Albatross D5A that we've got flying again. We uncovered the structure to overhaul the aircraft just 3 years ago, and we pulled off that very thick, heavy muslin type fabric, which he had no doubt picked up in Kingston or down on Canal Street somewhere at pennies on the dollar, and he made it work, and he got the airplanes in the air. It was always for Cole very important to have the airplanes in the air. That's what made an airplane real, was when it flew, was when it was in the air holding itself aloft. He didn't believe, as an owner or in his, later on as the organization morphed into more of a museum for the public to come see these artifacts, he didn't really believe in them being static pieces of sculpture, or art, or of of historical significance. He believed in them being seen in their natural element, and for an airplane that's in the air flying, from left to right. So that was a big part of his whole thing, was to get these airplanes flying again. So every airplane he ended up buying was generally for the explicit purpose of getting it in the air. Some of those airplanes it worked out better, and some it didn't work out so well. Some airplanes never flew very well, and they ended up becoming static displays. But everything at the aerodrome originally came with the express purpose of being flown at some point. Let's go to the next one. This is the airfield in the probably the late 50s. No, this got to be mid 60s because it's already been graded a little bit. But this is the original entrance, which now today serves as the walk-in entrance through the little covered bridge that we've got just there off of Norton Road. It opens up to the airfield. You can see moving left to right there, the hangar structure over on the right there is the oldest standing structure on the airfield that Cole erected. It's what we call our Curtiss hangar now because it is emblazoned with the Curtiss aircraft logo on the front of it. And on the back it says Old Rhinebeck Aerodrome, and it still does. When you drive across Norton, you'll see that hangar that says Old Rhinebeck Aerodrome on it. That's that original hangar, and it's still standing. You can see a couple different airplanes here. There's a couple privately owned airplanes, and then Cole's fleet, it looks like, which is a consolidated aircraft product that was built over in Utica. Cole's original idea for the airport was just to be a private airport where folks could have their airplanes based and fly in and out of. And there were a number of people in the early days who, and all up through the years, who have kept their airplanes at the aerodrome. In addition to it being a museum and being a place to see air shows on the weekend, it was an airfield for folks to base out of and fly out of, and that's what we're seeing there.
And they no longer do that?
We do in a more limited fashion. The museum and the air show has every single year grown to the point where it's kind of taken over the entire place. So that if there's an empty hangar on the airfield, well, we've got another airplane we can put in it. So there's one privately owned hangar adjacent to the property that actually was owned by Bob Love, who was a longtime resident here of the Rhinebeck area. He was a pilot himself, as well as being an engineer, and he erected his own hangar behind his house, which is now the Stone Church B&B. And so there's that one private hangar, and everything else is owned by the aerodrome, and everything else we keep aerodrome airplanes in primarily. Let's go to the next one. This is the original Southwest Snipe. Looking at the second hangars to be built, which are still standing. They're in desperate need of renovation and restoration, but those hangars are still standing. The Southwest Snipe was it came late in the war. It was a 1918 product. It was essentially the frontline fighter at the end of the war. It was the culmination of all the technology that was developed through World War I up to the end. This was essentially what we would consider the F-22 Raptor of today. It was the preeminent fighter to come out of the Allied system. Next to it there is the Fokker D-7. That was the preeminent fighter to come out of the Axis, the Central Powers. It was designed by Anthony Fokker. It came into service 1917 and quickly became quite the opponent for the Allies. It had a devastating effect when it was tangled with preeminent. So it's a neat picture because it shows you the two preeminent fighters, that at the end of World War I, where our technology had brought us, both for the Allied side and for the Central Powers.
The Southwest Snipe there, kind of neat story. When Cole originally put that bid on all those planes from the Roosevelt Field Collection, Clay had mentioned he put two bids. He put one bid on the entire 6 of them, and he put one separate bid just on the Southwest Snipe, just in case he didn't win the whole collection. He really, really wanted that plane, and that plane is now on display at the Smithsonian. So
it was bequeathed to the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum upon Cole's death. It was a part of his will that airplane, along with a couple others, but that airplane especially, would be presented to the Air and Space. And if you go in the Air and Space Museum on the Mall, the original Air and Space Museum, and go into the World War I, room display, it's hanging up above. You can see it right over the walkway. That airplane poking out right there is the Avro 504K. That's probably the original one. That's the one he bought in the auction, I would say, because the second one didn't come along until the late 60s or 70s. But that was a trainer and an observation platform for the Allied powers during the war. Next one. This is the Aeromarine 39B. One of the airplanes purchased in the auction. It was used as a trainer. It was primarily a training platform for the Allied powers. It was underpowered and not much of a winner in terms of being a good trainer because the power plant had a tendency to catch on fire. So it was powered by a Hall Scott engine, which did not have a good reputation. So the airplane, wasn't as popular as like the Curtiss Jenny, which we all tend to know and love. The Aeromarine B is still in the collection, although on a trip back from the city, and I don't know why it went down there in the first place, other than
it was part of a commercial shoot that they were doing for a cigarette company here at the aerodrome. And they were doing the shoot and it was taking longer than they thought, and the background kind of changed. So instead of waiting until next year, they ended up trucking it south to where the leaves are, I guess, still green. And on the way down, a cigarette was thrown out of a car and caught the aircraft on fire in Cole's trailer.
those cellulose-based solvents and sealants that are used to seal the fabric were quite flammable. And so any little spark would send it up just like that. So ironic that it would be a cigarette shoot a film shoot for a cigarette company that they were doing, and it would be a cigarette that would be flicked into the airplane to catch it on fire. So it caught on fire.
We assume that's a fire extinguisher in the front of the picture?
Yes. The airplane is, we still have the parts and pieces for that airplane. Parts of it are on display, very charred and burnt up. We've never gotten rid of the airplane because it's incredibly rare. It's a very, very rare piece of artifact. And so, our long-term goal at some point is to build up a new airplane out of those bits and pieces that we've got. It is a neat old airplane that we'd like to give a try at some point in the spirit of Palen.
It's also very significant to us because it's the only one out of those original 6 aircraft that's still in our collection. The other ones have been gone to the Air and Space Museum, the Air Force Museum, or other museums. Mm-hmm. That's the only one that remains in the collection.
There was an Aeromarine B, 39B like this, based here at that old airport that is off of 308 that is no longer there. But we have pictures of an airplane identical to this based right here in the Red Hook Rhinebeck area in the early 20s, which gives it a neat local connection too. This is a staged shot. This is from 1960 something. It looks like it's straight out of 1909. The gentleman in the aircraft is a gentleman named Dave Fox.
I worked with him, and he died in IBM Kingston.
Dave was an IBM employee. He was had a deep Texas drawl and was quite the showman, and had a long history at the aerodrome, essentially from the beginning, as a close confidant of Cole Palen's. And Dave passed away in 1980, or 1979. 80, 81, somewhere in there. He was killed in a plane crash, not at the aerodrome. He was testing out a friend's airplane over at the Kingston airport, making a first test flight on the airplane, and there was a failure of the airframe, and he perished in the accident. But he had flown every airplane at the aerodrome and was quite popular and a neat guy. But they're staging a shot there. He's playing the part of Louis Blériot, sitting in a Blériot 11, right? That is the oldest continuously operating aircraft in the Western Hemisphere. It's original. It's second only to another Blériot that's based in England and is only about 50 serial numbers newer. Or older in this sense than this airplane. So it's number 2 in the world. We still fly it every weekend. We don't fly it very high. It only hops down the runway. We get it about 3 feet off the ground and just let it motor along. It is it's too rare an example to risk flying it around the field over the trees, above the tree line. So we just get it above the ground and hop it down the length and set it down. It's go one more forward. That's a side view of the airplane. You can see how, what's the word I'm looking for? It's, it just looks a little ungainly. And it flies a little ungainly too. So but we still operate it every weekend, and it's the oldest airplane in the U.S. and it's the oldest airplane in the Western Hemisphere, and it's based here at Rhinebeck, which is really kind of neat.
Do all of these planes precede the Wright brothers?
No. The Wright brothers were the first, 1903, to make the first heavier-than-air flight. This example of an airplane is a Blériot 11, designed by Louis Blériot, who in 1908, he crossed the English Channel. Louis Blériot was the first man to fly across the English Channel. From in his case, he flew from England back to France, and he designed that airplane in the late first decade of the 20th century, and became quite wealthy, designing and selling a long line of these Blériot aircraft that gained worldwide recognition. The French actually led worldwide aviation development in the early the early 1900s into the teens, right up to the war. They saw the benefits of aviation in terms of transportation and for use in military pursuits long before we did here over in the States. The United States aviation program actually trailed behind the rest of the world by a great extent. It really wasn't until Charles Lindbergh's flight that the United States became air-minded, as it were, and we really started building up, any kind of infrastructure to support aviation here in the States. We'll do the next one. It's always been a group affair at the aerodrome. Cole was a very likable, gregarious man who always laughed a lot and always had a good time. And he attracted people who enjoyed the idea of old airplanes as much as he did. And so, going back to the very beginning, there was always a group of people to help out. In this case, the tag at the bottom says the Fokker hangar collapses after a heavy snow, damaging numerous recently restored aircraft. Cole is second from the left. A bad day, but friends rallied to help him out, and he always had a smile on his face, even through the worst trouble that he might experience. And there was a fair amount of it along the way, but he was always ready to jump right in and fix it and keep on flying. Let's go to the next one. This is a picture of Cole's first triplane, Fokker DR-1 triplane that he had at the airfield. He built this airplane from scratch. There's actually no remaining original examples of the Fokker DR-1 triplane. The last known examples were destroyed in the bombing of Berlin in World War II. They were actually on display in museums in and around the Berlin area, and none survived the Second World War. So if you want to have a Fokker DR-1 triplane nowadays, you got to build one from scratch. Cole was able to do so by acquiring plans and building to those plans. It was powered by an original engine, which was called a rotary engine. It's a type of engine in which the entire crankcase and cylinders are bolted to the propeller, and the entire engine spins. And it does that in order to provide a cooling effect and eliminate the need at the time for liquid cooling. In the beginning, leading up to the First World War, you really had two choices for power plants. One was fixed power plants that used liquid, cooling for their cooling efforts, and a rotary type engine which actually whirled around in a circular motion, and that whirling motion was what provided the cooling effect to the cylinders. We didn't yet have static radial engines like we know from the DC-3 or the Stearman or something like that. Those would come actually post World War I for the most part. So his had an original Lerone rotary engine, and that airplane still remains in our museum. It's in our collection. It's on static display now. We don't operate it any longer. But that's the airplane that Cole flew all those years in the air shows every Sunday when he would get shot down as the Black Baron. Let's go to the next one. That's it in flight with Dick King's Sopwith Pup in trail. Dick King was one of the original, enthusiasts who joined Cole in the whole idea of making the aerodrome into an international attraction. We see Cole's DR-1 triplane. You can actually see the engine, the blur of the engine whirling underneath the cowling there, where it's actually spinning. And I didn't bring you video, but I should have. Let's go to the next one. In-flight shot from the Sopwith Pup, trailing the DR-1. That's Dick King flying that. Let's go to the next one. Cole, in addition to building up his airport there at Norton and Stone Church, in order to pay the bills, he had very much a traveling roadshow. If people were willing to pay for his airplanes to make an appearance at an away air show at some other airport, as far away as Michigan and Mississippi and Florida. He would box the airplanes up and he would truck them down there. We're seeing a picture from a promotional tour for the movie Those Magnificent Men and Their Flying Machines, which came out in the late 60s. Cole was employed with a number of his early Pioneer aircraft, pre-World War I, to make a circuit here in the Northeast and put those airplanes on display. In fact, there's a picture, I don't think it's in here, but there's a picture of one of his, I believe it's the Blériot down in Times Square, with the billboard for Those Magnificent Men and Their Flying Machines underneath it, and it's sitting up on top of the little police station right there at the center of Times Square. Kind of neat. Let's go next.
Look at the skis.
Yeah, the purpose is to keep the airplane from nosing over.
Oh.
You can see the wheels. The skids stick out to provide a safety device to keep the airplane from nosing over on its nose. Thomas Pusher, right?
Mm-hmm.
This airplane Cole actually used, and this is on another tour. This is on a display tour for the movie. You can see behind it is the one of the Blériots that he had, and a Passat ornithopter, which is one of those contraptions that actually flaps its wings and never gets off the ground. But the Thomas Pusher, this airplane right here, was a flying example that Cole flew extensively throughout the 60s and early 70s. It's on display in our museum still. This is the airplane that Cole actually flew from the aerodrome down to LaGuardia. He landed at LaGuardia and then went on to be on the air show, TV show I've Got a Secret, where his secret was he had flown this old-timey airplane down the Hudson River to the city to be on the show, and no one could figure it out.
They actually asked him about the skis on the show,
Yeah.
and he said, "Oh, it's to keep you from nosing over." And they said, "Oh, how's that work?" He said, "I don't know. I broke them both on the first flight."
Let's go to the next. Another roadshow picture with the what appears to be the triplane and the Newport 28, both in a box truck. Like I said, Cole would go to away air shows, reassemble the airplanes at the away airport, and fly for crowds at other air shows across the country. So he very much was on the road in the early days. In the early days, late 50s, early 60s, he didn't have a scheduled air show like we do nowadays. As you all know, every weekend from May to October, we're flying the airplanes in the air shows at the aerodrome. That wasn't the case in the very beginning. In the very beginning, it was more of, the airplanes were trucked from location to location and displayed out, in the field. And we'll go to the next one. A lot of work, and you can see here's a lot of the work going into it. This is Cole's Newport 28 being assembled in some military hangar. You can see there's a T-33 in the background there. It was a lot of work putting the airplanes together, but it was good money. Folks were paying good money for the airplane to hit the road, and that's what kept food on the table for Cole, and it's what allowed him to keep flying the airplanes, which was paramount for him. He wanted to be able to fly these old airplanes and continue accumulating more. Next one. Another shot of the airplane at an air show. The C-121 behind it. Next one. These are not all aerodrome airplanes, because that's not ours. But the SPAD 13 is ours. You can see it's Battle Creek, Michigan. The D7 is probably not ours. That's another. He would meet other airplanes at the airports where air shows would hire other folks to bring in their airplanes as well. I'm not sure where that is, but it's some major, modern airport where he's displaying the the Thomas Pusher.
Neat picture of him propping the plane. We still do that. We still start the planes by hand, and they don't have starters or anything like that.
Very much like the old Model Ts and Buicks and whatnot had the hand crank down on the front. Old airplanes start the same way. They don't necessarily have electrical systems. It simply has a magneto-driven ignition So to start the airplane, you actually have to flip the prop to energize the magneto and create the spark. Next. This is Hammondsport, Western New York. That's Cole standing in front of his Hanrio reproduction. This is an airplane that was built by Cole and a friend of his named Andy Keefe. It's not the greatest picture. You can't get a real good feel for the fuselage and how it's actually built, but it's very much shaped like a rowing skiff. The airplane was designed by a man named Hanrio who had made his money in building rowing skiffs. So he used that same method of construction to build the hull for his first aircraft, and had a long line of Pioneer aircraft that were based on this design. It's one of our best flying Pioneer aircraft at the aerodrome. It flies every weekend in the summertime still. The airplane was built in the early 70s and debuted at the aerodrome in the early 70s and has been flying here ever since. It was trucked to Hammondsport along with a couple other airplanes to be on display there at the Curtiss factory, the original, the Curtiss home place. So next one. This is noted visitors to the aerodrome over the years. The aerodrome, because of what it was, attracted a lot of noteworthy aviation, luminaries and celebrities over the years. This is Arthur Ray Brooks. He was a World War I fighter ace whose airplane is actually on display at the Smithsonian. It's not the SPAD that Cole had, but he was a SPAD 13 pilot in the First World War, and so he made multiple visits over the years to the aerodrome to visit, and we always had a great time having him. I can remember as a kid in the 80s seeing him at the aerodrome and taking it all in. He liked to just sit. Cole, in addition to loving old airplanes, he loved old Cadillacs, and he had an old pink 1959 Cadillac, and he would always put Arthur in the right seat of the Cadillac and park it right out there at Show Center so that Arthur had the whole view to himself, and I can remember sitting with him in the back seat. Let's go to the next one. This is Clarence Chamberlain. He was the second person to cross the Atlantic nonstop. He was in the race to cross the Atlantic along with Charles Lindbergh and others, and he made the flight a week later, and actually flew on to Germany from Roosevelt Field. So he actually extended the nonstop record a little further than Lindbergh had. But it's funny, Lindbergh's, celebrity status never waned. He was forever famous once he made that flight for a whole litany of reasons. Everyone else who came behind him, would make that flight, and they never reached the same amount of notoriety. Lindbergh was a perfect storm of his boyish charm and being solo and being young and being successful.
Did he have a similar aircraft to the Spirit of St. Louis?
Chamberlain? Yeah, he did. It was a Belanca, so it was single engine, and it had the same type of engine. It used the same Wright J5 power plant that Spirit of St. Louis used. He actually had a co-pilot with him, so it was two pilots in that aircraft that Clarence Chamberlain made the flight with. But it was actually the airplane that Lindbergh originally wanted to purchase, which was called a Belanca. He tried to purchase that airplane, and the owners, which was at the time Belanca Wright owned a part share in the airplane. Wright was the engine manufacturer. They were willing to sell it to Lindbergh as long as they were allowed to choose the pilot, which meant Lindbergh wouldn't have been the pilot. So he turned down the offer to purchase that airplane, and that was the genesis of him going out to San Diego and commissioning the Ryan Aircraft Company to manufacture the Spirit of St. Louis as we know it today. Next one. This is Pappy Boynton, World War II ace. He was an F-4U pilot in the Pacific Theater. Made a couple visits after the war, in the 60s and 70s. This is Cole, and he's standing in front of the SPAD 13. This is actually an away show. This isn't at the aerodrome. I think this is at Wright-Patterson, if I remember the history of the picture. But Wright-Patterson Air Force Base is in Dayton, Ohio, and that's where the Air Force, the original Air Force testing facility was, and it's also where our U.S. Air Force Museum is now. Next one. Eddie Rickenbacker, next to our SPAD 13. Of course, Eddie Rickenbacker made his name as a fighter ace flying SPADs in the First World War. He later went on to found Eastern Airlines, and he was a CEO of Eastern all up through the 60s. Next one. Jimmy Doolittle. This is actually on a recreation. The airplanes, the picture is taken during a reenactment that Jimmy Doolittle participated in using our Curtiss Fledgling biplane, which was a trainer in the interwar periods in the 30s, you know, after World War I, prior to World War II. Jimmy Doolittle was a young and upcoming test pilot flying for the Army Air Corps. Jimmy Doolittle made the first blind landing, which is to say he flew completely on instruments with no outside references. So what they actually had was, you know, the Curtiss Fledgling was similar to the type of aircraft that was used. It was open cockpit biplane, but they actually had a canvas cover that would go over the cockpit for the training, and for the purpose of the flight, they had that cover over the airplane and or over the cockpit, and Jimmy sat in that cockpit and flew strictly by instruments and radio commands to circle the airplane around and line it up for a landing at the airport, and he was the first to do that. It's from that, you know, those first blind flying tests that we eventually developed the capability to fly in the clouds with reference only to the instrumentation in the aircraft, which allowed us to make airline travel, you know, safe and dependable. So he very much was, before, you know, before he was the, you know, general that we all know from the Tokyo raids and the Doolittle Raiders. He was a test pilot for U.S. Army Air Corps up to World War II, and prior to that he was a famous racing pilot, and he worked for Shell Oil Company in the 30s and raced a number of aircraft for Shell Oil, in addition to helping to promote Shell oil products for aviation use. Next. Johnny Miller was a local celebrity from Poughkeepsie. He was very early on in the 30s. He was a noted barnstormer that was based out of Red Oaks Mill. It was purportedly Johnny Miller who may very well have given Cole Palen his first airplane ride. Johnny went on to be a pilot for Eastern Airlines, and later on in life he was the oldest flying pilot in the United States at 106 years old when he passed away. He kept his health up until the very end, and he was a regular visitor to the aerodrome and a close confidant of Cole's, and very much a connection back to the past and the original barnstormers that Cole was emulating and that we continue to emulate every weekend. Captain Kangaroo. The aerodrome starred in an episode of the Captain Kangaroo show. I haven't ever seen it myself. Have you seen it? Yeah. But they had a good time. Everyone still remembers it. All the old timers. Next one. Mike and I are speculating that these are actually Cole's parents, and I don't know the whole backstory there, but I haven't ever heard anything negative. You'd think you'd think parents would try and keep their kids from doing these, you know, wild hair ideas like making your own airport and buying 6 airplanes and keeping them in the chicken coop out behind the house. But Cole was able to do it, and I have no doubt it was because of the support of his parents. And that's his original SPAD that he purchased at the auction. Next. Rita Palen was his wife. He married Rita in the 1960s, late 60s. He didn't get to build airplanes in his living room anymore after that. He had to move out and go to the hangar so that Rita could have a house. But she was very much a stabilizing effect in his life, and she was very much the financial rock that Cole was able to benefit from, in terms of, it was Rita who really made the air shows and the airfield profitable and allowed Cole to continue building the collection into what we know today as a world-renowned collection of antique aircraft. So very much equal parts Cole and Rita when it came down to actually developing the aerodrome into a worldwide attraction where you could come and see these airplanes. Cole, from talking to folks who were around back then, Cole got tired of having to truck the airplanes from air show to air show to keep making money. At the same time, he was attracting more people to his little airfield here in Rhinebeck who were making a pilgrimage to see these airplanes fly. They would pull the airplanes out every few weekends, pull everything out, and fly it around the pattern and demonstrate the aircraft, and they would pass the hat around. And that was the genesis of the air shows. In the late 60s and the early 70s, the aerodrome benefited from an article that was put into National Geographic, which brought people from all over the world interested in seeing these airplanes. They also were a part of a Texaco ad that, I can't remember the exact nature of the ad, but it was essentially the ad would feature some place to spend a tank of gas on. So they wanted folks to buy more gas. Well, here's a place for you to go visit.
Right.
And oh, by the way, put Texaco gasoline in your car to do it. And that had a huge effect. Cole always said they had a huge boost in numbers after that Texaco ad came out. And it got to the point where in the late 70s, there was, on any given Saturday or Sunday, there would be 5,000 to 6,000 people in the crowd. A lot of them were local Hudson Valley people. A lot of them were folks coming up from the city. A lot of them were folks that were trekking in from all over the U.S., whether it was by car or by train or by airline. Folks were coming more and more to see these airplanes. And it got to where he was giving air shows every single weekend from May to October, and we've continued that ever since. And much of it is with thanks to Rita, because she ended up getting the checkbook under control. Next.
Is she still living?
No, she passed away in 2002.
2000 or 2001,
Yeah.
something like that. Very early 2000.
Cole preceded her in death. Cole passed away in 1993. He had a stroke at his summer home his winter home down in Boca, and he passed away in '93. Prior to his passing, he had the forethought to create a foundation that would own the aircraft in perpetuity, and when he passed away, Rita assumed the helm of that foundation and ran it until her passing in 2001, 2002. It's from that foundation that the Board of Trustees was developed, that Mike and I sit on today to manage and administer the collection and the air shows itself, so that we're able to keep doing what we do, which is every weekend pull the airplanes out and give air shows for people from all over the world. Recent projects have included our Albatross D5A. This is an airplane that was a frontline fighter in the for the German powers in World War I, 1916, 1917. It's actually the type of aircraft that the Red Baron, Manfred von Richthofen, got the majority of his kills. He had 80 confirmed kills at the time of his death. Upwards of 70 some odd kills were made in the Albatross, not in the triplane that everyone identifies the Red Baron with flying. He actually came to the triplane late in his career as a fighter pilot. The majority of his conquests were made in this type of aircraft. Cole built this airplane from scratch in the 70s. He got it flying in 1975, I think, after the Smithsonian has an original Albatross D5A that they had done a full ground up restoration on, and while it was in the shop getting restored in Washington, D.C., Cole was allowed to come in and take measurements off of that original aircraft. And so from those precise measurements, he constructed his own copy of that airplane, and we still fly it today. It got a little long in the tooth. Got to a point where we had stopped flying it, put it on static display, and we're in need of giving it an overhaul. 2013, I guess we started it, right? Into the 14th season. We overhauled the airplane. We'll see a picture of the wings. You can go to the next one. The wings were all uncovered. This is neat because you can see the structure underneath the fabric covered wings. You can see it's a wood spar with wooden ribs, wooden leading edges circling around it, along with the tail surfaces too. And so everything was uncovered and then recovered with new fabric. And go to the next one. The fuselage was stripped of all of its varnish and paint. And go to the next one. And we wanted to change it up, so we chose a new paint scheme. Fighter pilots in the First World War were given carte blanche to identify themselves with their airplanes in any way they saw fit. We chose to recreate the paint scheme of a Bavarian pilot from Austria named Hans Boning, and he chose to put the Bavarian flag on his airplane. So go to the next one, and that's the fuselage after it was redone. Go to the next one, and they're reinstalling the wings. We still have, the aerodrome has always thrived on people who love to be around the old airplanes, and we very much are very dependent on volunteer help, as well as our staff, who are all dedicated old airplane enthusiasts. So there's always a helping hand when you need it, and we're always looking for more folks to come lend a hand if they wish. So this is a group of, our chief mechanic here, Ken Cassens, is directing the effort, along with a bunch of volunteers who are helping to provide manpower to reassemble the airplane. You go to the next one. And that's it, all finished. Yeah, it's beautiful, and we're flying it again every weekend. So, we got a good 35 years out of it, and we'll get another 35 to 40 years out of it in the new paint scheme as we fly it every weekend. There's a couple more in-flight shots coming up. Go to the next. That's just prior to the first flight. Test run. And that's it in the air over the Hudson Valley.
Oh,
Beautiful.
what a thrill.
Looks like a fish. The Renault Taxi is a French vehicle that's original, that's in the collection. It was acquired in the 60s. This picture is from the 60s, no doubt. Go to the next one. Getting along in the tooth, it was pretty worn out. It had been used consistently every weekend in the air shows for 45 years. Go to the next one. This is Kurt Muller, who is a retired IBM. Stu Somerville is an educator working here in the Valley. And Sean Crimmins are all part of our car guys. We have airplane guys at the airfield, and we have a lot of car guys, because we're not just about displaying airplanes. We're about essentially it's almost more of a transportation museum than it is anything else, because we've got cars, we've got airplanes, we've got motorcycles, we've even got a high wheel bicycle. So we have a dedicated group of volunteers who work on our cars for us that are natural gearheads, and they were heading up the effort to restore it into a French taxi. The next one came out looking like that.
Cool.
The Marne taxis were famous for, in World War I, providing mobilization for the French troops to move out of Paris out to the front lines when the Germans were breaking through. And it was really the first use of the automobile as a mobilization tool for ground forces. prior to that, everything was infantry. Infantry walked, cavalry rode on horses, and the field artillery were towed, by horse-drawn carriages. The Marne taxis were put into service to very quickly move troops to the front lines, and obviously set a precedent, to the point where the horses were phased out and automobiles were phased in. Next. The physical plant at the aerodrome is always in need of upkeep, replacement, overhaul. Here we've got a covered bridge that for 40 years it stood at the aerodrome there to be able to cross over the creek from one courtyard to the next. It had gotten to the point of disrepair where it wasn't serviceable any longer, and we actually had to replace it. So this is Mike up on the top of the rafters there, nailing in the roof. Next one. And that's the finished product. With our, this is just a couple weeks ago, the picture was taken. These actually come out, these are windows, but we've got them covered up for the winter so that the elements don't get in. But Kurt Muller, who we showed earlier, is one of the car guys, is also a good artist and actually painted those pilot's goggles for us, so that when you drive down Norton Road and you look across the pond, you can see those staring back at you. All right. Spirit of St. Louis. One of Cole's dreams was to have a flying Spirit of St. Louis replica at the aerodrome. Charles Lindbergh, jump-started American aviation when he made the trip across the Atlantic, and he became a symbol for boys all throughout the United States as, what could be done. And he became quite the hero, and he was quite the hero to Cole Palen. And so Cole acquired this engine, which is an original Wright Whirlwind, 220 horsepower. It's called a Wright J5.
Is that a rotary?
That's not a rotary. That's a fixed radial engine. So it just uses the the passage of air over the cylinders as the airplane flies through the air to cool it. So a little different than the rotaries from the World War I period. The Wright J5 is famous because it's really the first engine that provided the reliability that was needed to do something like cross the Atlantic and run continuously for the 33.5 hours that it did for Charles Lindbergh. So up until then, the service life of aviation power plants was somewhat limited. They were still, metallurgy was in its infancy. They were still learning how to get a good lifespan out of things like airplane engines. And the Wright Whirlwind engine was the first truly reliable power plant that could be depended on. And it went on, Wright Aeronautical Corporation went on to a long, career or a long, lifespan of making power plants all, up to the point where they were, making ballistic missiles in the 60s. But the Wright Whirlwind got them across the country, and got them across the North Atlantic. Cole was able to acquire a Wright J5 original, style engine to the Spirit of St. Louis in the late 70s, and that was no doubt served as the genesis for the project. Once he had the original engine, he knew he could build an airplane around it, and that's what he ended up doing. He and his crew started the project. It was sidelined for a number of years. After Cole's death, it was decided, he passed away in 1993, it was decided that as a tribute to him, we would finish the project. And so a new push was started to complete the airframe. And go to the next slide. This is it rolled out. It got to a point where it was about 3/4 of the way done, and it was sidelined for a number of years. The Ken Cassens, our chief mechanic, was away from the aerodrome for about 10 years. And he came back in 2013 and restarted the project, picked up where he had left off, and this is us rolling the airplane in to start that process again. Go to the next one. And that's Ken with the finished airplane just prior to the first flight. We'll go to the next one. It was truly a 100% fabrication. The original obviously is hanging in the Smithsonian. the airplane was not produced as, Ryan didn't go on to make a dozen Spirit of St. Louis's. They made other airplanes that were based off of the Spirit of St. Louis design, but it was one-of-a-kind airplane built for a one-of-a-kind purpose. Now there's been a couple other reproductions that were built over the years. Cole's reproduction here that we've just finished this past winter is what we consider the most faithful reproduction to the airplane at the point that it crossed the Atlantic. So it was built from the ground up. A whole fuselage structure was welded up from steel tubing. The wooden wing, which you saw bare a couple of slides ago, was built up from scratch. All of the cowling was formed by Ken in the shop to shape the cowling and all that, which is an art in and of itself. And bringing it all together into this airplane that's meticulously crafted to replicate the original. Ken actually was given access at the Smithsonian to the original the first 2 times via a cherry picker. He was raised up in the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum on a cherry picker to the level of the Spirit of St. Louis, because it hangs actually in the air in the main atrium when you walk in the Smithsonian. So he was raised up and able to move around the airplane, take measurements, take pictures, and build the airplane based on those measurements of the original. We'll go to the next one.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
Is he an employee or a volunteer?
Ken is an employee
Uh-huh.
who volunteers a lot of his time. So it's a little bit of both.
Did he take it up for the first flight?
He did. And he's the only person to date to have flown it so far.
Okay.
And will be our primary pilot on the airplane as long as he wishes. This is Ken running the airplane up prior to the first flight. Go to the next one. That's a really neat shot for me, because it's very much, this is how the airplane would have looked in 1927. It very much epitomizes the idea that we aim to allow folks at the aerodrome to relive history, the way it happened. So this airplane doesn't just sit in some room gathering dust. It's pulled out every weekend and flown so that people can see it take off, they can hear it, they can smell it, they can feel it. That airplane takes off past you and you can actually feel the thump of the engine and propeller in your chest as it passes by. It's that sort of visceral feeling that the aerodrome is built around and has become famous for. And this, to me, it's very much takes me back in time to see it sitting there running like that. Next one. And then to see it in the air, this is the first takeoff, December 5th of this past year. It made its first inaugural test flight. Go to the next one. And that's it's not over the water, it's not over the bridge, it's over the Rokeby farm actually. But the airplane was test flown over the course of about 2 weeks prior to the bad weather settling in the end of December around Christmas. And it performed flawlessly, had no issues during the test flight, some minor tweaking here and there, but nothing drastic. And we're going to roll it out May 21st is going to be the first public unveiling for the airplane, and we've got more information that we can hand out at the end here. We're actually, the air shows start in June, so June 11th this year is the first Saturday air show. Prior to that, on May 21st, we're going to have the public unveiling and the first public flight of the Spirit of St. Louis, an opportunity for folks to come in the gate and see the airplane make its first flight for the public. So there's information on our website, and there's information on some handouts we've got here. But we certainly encourage everyone to come visit the aerodrome for the day. We'll have a lot of activities going on, from tours of the museum itself to hopefully having some talks about Lindbergh and about the golden age of aviation in the late 20s. And we'll have all the automobiles out. We'll have some airplanes out shooting landings. We actually have Reeve Lindbergh, who is the daughter of Charles Lindbergh. She's attending. She's our, what do you want to call her? Keynote speaker, keynote guest.
Guest of honor.
Guest of honor. And she's going to be there to see the airplane make its first flight. And We'll also have Mark Molinaro there. Mark Molinaro has been a huge supporter of the aerodrome during his years in public office, and he was very much, you know, a fundraiser for the project. So we'll be honoring him as well with a presentation.
Who was
And
the fundraiser?
Mark Molinaro
Oh,
was a big part of it. The fundraising was handled on multiple fronts. Mark did a great deal of it for us. So the flight will be at 5:30 in the afternoon on May 21st. The gate opens at 10 and folks can spend the day at the aerodrome. After the first flight, we're going to transition into an evening fundraiser, which is a RSVP affair, where you can get more info from the website and from the invitations we have there, but certainly encourage anyone to attend the fundraiser who might like to partake in that as well.
are you going to be the one flying?
No, Ken, who was in the cockpit there, will be making that first flight probably. Yeah, there he is. See if there's one more. That's our current, you know, that's probably a fourth of our entire crew. That's the kind of the winter crew that was there for the first flight on that December day. You know, it takes a village to run the aerodrome, so to speak.
Right.
It's, Cole was a very, what's the word? Cole always attracted people, and the people wanted to help Cole, and we get a lot of people who still want to help the aerodrome, and that's what all these people are. These are the folks who come out and lend a hand in some form or fashion to make the airplanes fly. What's the next one? Yeah, so that's the save the date card for the Spirit of St. Louis. And I think that's the last one. Oh no, we got more. So if everyone remembers, in August of this past summer, the original gift shop on the airfield was consumed by a fire. It started in an electrical outlet on the north side of the building. We have to imagine it was an open crawl space underneath that was open to the elements, so we had a lot of mice and other rodents. So they were probably up there eating things. And it was very much an old structure that was all wood, and you know, very unfortunate that we lost it. We were very quickly able to put in place a plan to replace it. We had identified a need to replace the gift shop regardless, and actually to be able to put in flushable toilets down on the airfield. Since 1958, the place had always had porta potties, and an outhouse in the beginning, and porta potties all up until there. You know, even last year we still have porta potties down on the airfield. Now we do have flushable toilets, but they're up the hill in the museum buildings. So when you're down watching the air show, your only option was to use a portalet, and that's not good for repeat business with the ladies. So we made the decision to put in real toilets in a new gift shop, which this is aftermath. It completely consumed the building. Next slide. That's clearing out the mess. And this is the new construction. So we didn't want to start the gift shop quite as soon as we ended up having to. We were going to get a couple more seasons out of it, probably to you know, be able to fully fund the structure and have everything in place. You know, due to the fire and by you know, reassessing our resources and finances and whatnot, we were able to go ahead and start a new structure, and the next slide I think is the foundation. We've since built, you know, all of the walls in, and they're about to put the roof in probably next week. So a lot of construction going on over the winter. There's the walls going around. We've been very blessed by a very mild winter, so we're actually ahead of schedule. We had planned all along to do this over the winter and have it ready for the first air show June 11th. Now we're certainly on track to have it ready for the Spirit of St. Louis flight on the 21st. So one more. That's the rendering of the new building, which very much looks like the old building. only difference being the bathrooms will be down here on this lower level on the left side. One more. Additional projects, our Monocoop 113 is an original that Cole purchased in the 60s. We've been renovating it, restoring it through the help of an expert in this aircraft type who's based down in Virginia. Go to the next one. That's a bad shot. Go to the next one. That's the airplane restored, the fuselage restored and sitting on its gear again down in Virginia. Next shot. And this is it being unloaded at the aerodrome here over the winter. Actually, it was last fall that the airplane was brought in. The fuselage is all done. It just has to be assembled. The engine is overhauled. It just has to be bolted on. The wings are in the process of being constructed right now. Next one. That's looking out of our History of Flight building, which is the museum up on the hill. The original. This is neat. This is an original consolidated aircraft instrument cluster. Those things are priceless. You can't buy them anymore. And it's so neat to see original things like that overhauled, restored, rebuilt, and used again. And that's what we're all about at the aerodrome. This is a reproduction of a Fokker Eindecker, FOK E3. You can see a Fokker E3 is the nomenclature for the airplane. It was the first fighter in the war to truly be successful in what it was designed to do, which was to shoot down other airplanes. It was what led to what was called the Fokker Scourge in late 1916, when the Allies suffered a great deal of aerial defeats at the hands of these airplanes because they were so maneuverable and because they employed certain abilities that up to that point had not been possible, which were things like having a machine gun that could fire through the propeller blades of the airplane. Anthony Fokker actually designed a cam mechanism that would time the shooting of the machine gun so that it only shot through the propeller arc when the propeller was out of the way. Huge game changer in technology. Next one.
Wasn't our First World War planes that were constructed here or in the States more reconnaissance? They would go out and just try to find where the troops were?
They were.
Rather than fighters?
Airplanes built, of course, the United States came to the war late. End of the war essentially. Curtiss Jennies were manufactured in the U.S. They were mainly used as trainers. There were airplanes that were manufactured under license from de Havilland. De Havilland being a British company, built under license here in the States called a DH-4. They were observation airplanes, you're absolutely right. They were also called flying coffins because the fuel tanks had the knack of rupturing in flight and rupturing on any kind of small crack up and causing the airplane to become a conflagration.
What type of aircraft was Quentin Roosevelt chosen?
It's a great question.
I don't know that.
I don't know that one off the top of my head. I'm not certain. There was a frontline fighter that was developed, but it was too late to make it to the war, and that was a Tommy Morse. It's a Tommy Morse Scout. They were actually designed and built in Utica. It's a New York airplane. The aerodrome has an original Tommy Morse Scout in its collection that is on our long list of airplanes to be restored. It's an original aircraft. It will probably be restored to flyable condition, but it might never be flown again because of its rarity and provenance. But these are the wings from the Eindecker being pulled down out of the barn. This is our Dutch barn, by the way. You drive down Norton Road, you'll see that pretty Dutch barn on the property right there next to the road. It's constructed in the late 1700s, early 1800s. We use it as storage, so it holds all the old treasures that we've got. Next one. This is the Eindecker in a restored, uncovered condition. It's not going to be a flying airplane. It's going to be static display only. It's going to be an airplane that we can easily haul from show to show so that we can start outreach efforts again, where we take the airplane to air shows, where we take it to conventions and expositions, where we can construct it inside a hall, or inside a hangar for folks to be able to come and look at and be introduced to the aerodrome from the outside. Next one. This is our 1914 brush runabout. It's neat because this engine's actually a single cylinder engine. It has one piston that goes up and down in the cylinder, and and a very large flywheel to get over the hump. But it's an original, and we're restoring it to original condition. You can go to the next one. That's Corey St. Pierre, who is a retired Xerox employee who now comes and helps us every weekend and every weekday. Part of the process of restoring it. It's a ground-up restoration, so every single part is being either restored, rebuilt, or replaced. Next one. This is our new sign. The old sign stayed with us for years and years, but became quite weathered over time and needed replacement. And so this is the new welcome sign, which has its own little roof, keeps the weather off of the off of the signage itself. And that was a big. It was more of a moral or a morale booster than anything else to see the new sign there in early last year and know that the place was really coming around again after a number of years where we had seen reduced numbers in our admission, our gate admission on the weekends, and everything was starting to turn around again and getting successful.
We've been working very hard to build things that last, things that we don't have to do a bunch of maintenance on every year. This sign is a good example of that. It was built with a roof, like Clay said, and John Belniak, a local cabinet maker, did all the beautiful woodwork on it. And you can see at the bottom there's some concrete. That doesn't show half the story. But underground there's a piece of concrete about as big as the front of a Volkswagen. Hold that thing in place, and we really built it to last. There's about 5 yards of concrete on each side.
When Cole,
it's a very substantial structure.
When Cole purchased the property, there was a creek that ran across the runway, and of course it would get even worse in the spring. He eventually ran a culvert under the runway to dry things out, but it emptied out into the pond, which is right there along Norton Road when you drive down there. That whole area down to there is just one big quagmire. It's very, very soft, and so we had to put those large footings in to stabilize the sign so that it wouldn't move around. All right. This is a 1927 Chandler automobile. It was restored by a gentleman who, upon his passing, a friend of the aerodrome arranged for its donation to the aerodrome. It's neat because it's a period car to our Spirit of St. Louis. So we'll be able to roll it out with the Spirit of St. Louis and 1927 Model T that we've got, along with a couple others, and very much make a period set piece, for folks to enjoy during the air shows. Next one. This is our new standard biplane. We own 2 airworthy new standard biplanes. This is the second of the 2 that's in the process of being restored. So it's an ongoing project at the aerodrome. Next one.
Now, will you be able to take people up in that? I see it's a 2-seater.
Yeah, so go back to it real quick.
It's a 2-seater?
We'll see another picture of the new standard here in a while. It's actually a 5-seater.
Oh, is it?
The pilot sits in the back, and there's 4 people who sit up front in a 2x2 configuration. So we can load 4 passengers in the airplane at once and take them over the Hudson Valley.
Wow.
Clay is our primary rides pilot, so if you stop by and go for a ride at the aerodrome, most likely Clay would be the one giving you a ride.
What's your weight limitation? I mean, obviously, I have to. With 4 people.
We can load it up. It's actually an amazing airplane. It was designed, I won't go deep into it, but in 1926, the newly formed Civil Aeronautics Board for the United States government was tasked with emphasizing safety and legitimizing the commercial air operations that were in place here in the United States. One of the first things they did was shut down all of the fly-by-night barnstormers and flying circus operators who were flying old surplus World War I equipment that was constantly breaking down, constantly crashing, and constantly causing consternation for the public. Civil Aeronautics Board was tasked with ensuring the safety of the American public. One of the first things they did was decree that commercial operators had to meet a certain set of standards in terms of the design and construction of the airplanes that they flew. And the new standard biplanes, of which we have 2, were the result of that mandate that the airplanes be made safer and they be new designs. The new standard was designed as a replacement for the rides hoppers to be able to go from town to town and hop rides and introduce people to aviation. And that's what we still do with it at the aerodrome, is take folks for open cockpit biplane rides over the Hudson Valley. We like to say that we'll take you high or low, fast or slow, any way you care to go. Special one-way trips for mother-in-laws. What's the next one? This is our Sopwith Dolphin, which was another late fighter in World War I. It came late to the game, 1918, but it made its name as a night fighter. It was actually used to great effect as a night interceptor of the bombers that were the German bombers that were bombing London there in the First World War. So we're
V8?
what's that?
Is that a V8?
That is a V8. That is a Hispano-Suiza V8. It's a water-cooled V8 power plant of 150 or 180 horsepower, depending on the type that was used, and water-cooled. This was built by Cole as a reproduction in the 70s. These pictures are taken in Florida, where he would spend his winters. He would work outside in the open air of the Florida sunshine over the course of the winter and bring his new treasures back to the aerodrome in the spring to be flown at the airfield. So we'll go to the next one. This is it in the air. It was a main standard at the aerodrome for almost 20 years, flying in the air shows every weekend. It was the main, one of the main airplanes that Dick King flew during his time there. And Dick actually suffered an engine failure and had to put the airplane down unexpectedly. He wasn't able to make it back to the airfield, so he landed in the trees just off the runway, walked away from the airplane, and was perfectly fine. The airplane was put into storage, and then its restoration was begun several years ago, and we're finally completing it here in the next year or so. This is the airplane recovered, and this past winter or two winters ago now, when we were rolling it out of the museum back down to the airfield. We'll go to the next one. On display at a trade show down in New Jersey. This is a wing party. We had the airplane and the wings in our shop there at the aerodrome. This is last winter. We had a number of volunteers that were helping us prepare the wing to be covered, to have its fabric covering put on. And you can see the young types. We have a number of young types who volunteer their time as well after school, during the school year, and whenever they want to come around during the summertime. One of the museum's main charters is the education of youth and the mentorship of youth who are interested in aeronautics and aviation in general. And we benefit from having several air-minded youngsters who like to come hang out at the aerodrome, and we got no problem putting them to work. So go to the next one. This is test fitting the wings prior to them being sent off for cover. Go to the next one. This is our second mechanic, Mark Mondello, who started at the aerodrome as a teenager, a 16-year-old young man who came to the aerodrome because a friend of his did. And he started working there and worked his way up through the ranks to the point where he went to, he completed college and then went back to school to become a mechanic, aviation mechanic. And he now serves as one of our paid mechanics there on the field. He's overhauling that Hispano-Suiza V8 that will be used in the Dolphin. Go to the next one. So he's a success story. He's a young type who became interested and ended up making it a career. This is our Model T pickup that we've morphed into a fuel truck. We'll go to the next one.
Oh, cool.
Red Crown gasoline, you can see the logo on the back there. Red Crown gasoline was the gasoline used by Charles Lindbergh in the Atlantic flight. This is our Davis D1W. It's in the process of being recovered right now. Go to the next one. This is our annual fall fundraiser in concurrence with our model airplane meet, our RC Jamboree radio controlled aircraft. We bring people from all over the country come in to fly their antique vintage radio controlled models, and this is our fundraiser associated with that in our main history of flight building, museum building up on the hill. The day after the Spirit of St. Louis flight, we're going to have our 12th annual memorial model meet for rubber band powered models. If everyone remembers from their youth building little stick and tissue models powered by a rubber band where you got to wind up the propeller. That was how Cole Palen would decompress. He would build, even up to 1993 when he passed away, he would build little model airplanes to help get them away from the real airplanes and give them something to pass the time. So we celebrate that by building our own little rubber band powered airplanes, and we bring a fair number of people in from outside to that event as well, so we're looking forward to celebrating that. This year's focus for the model airplane meet is the Spirit of St. Louis, so everyone's building a Spirit of St. Louis model. The next one. And that's Cole winding up the rubber band. You can see he's stretched.
Oh, yeah.
He's got his model and he's stretched the rubber band out and he has a winder that he's winding it up with. Next one. And that's a mass launch where everyone's launching airplanes all together. And they just go up and circle around. Our events throughout the course of the year include things as such like Artist Weekend, where artists are invited to come in and set up their system and create their own art for the day using whatever set piece they choose. Next one. Model tractor, antique tractor meet. Go to the next one, there's another shot. George Yance, a lot of folks may know, runs our tractor show every year and brings in all the antique tractors and whatnot to be on display. Fun day. These are 99s. The 99s is a ladies group, a national club associated with lady pilots, formed by the original group of female pilots who were making names for themselves in the 20s and 30s, Amelia Earhart, Jackie Cochran, folks like that. And so they visited Civil Air Patrol, visiting on the airport day with one of our reenactors. This is our weekend fashion show. Every Saturday and Sunday, the ladies and children and men, although we don't get as many men, are invited to come up on the stage and display vintage and antique fashions. And one of the gal up front here at the mic is our own Madison Reiter, who plays Trudy True Love in the air show every weekend. And she's hosting the fashion show for everyone there. Next one. This is a model airplane meet. This is the RC Jamboree that happens every September. We're actually coming on our 50th anniversary, 50 years consecutive that we've hosted this annual model meet, which is very, very well known. Next.
Wow.
Yeah. The neat thing about our model meet is the only real requirement is that your airplane that you model has to have been an airplane from pre-1940. So it can't be anything new. It has to be a model of an old airplane. Next one. Old car clubs. We have the Red Hook Car Club make a couple drive-ins every year. They're on display here. Next one. Corvette Club. Calendar shoot. We had the distinction of having a world-famous air-to-air photographer named Philip McKenna visit here about 2 years ago. He has a series of books and calendars under the title Ghosts. Because he's filming the ghosts of aviation past. So he came in and shot a bunch of our airplanes. That's our Curtis Jenny in flight. Next one. Our SPAD 7, which is a reproduction. This is our Fokker D7 and our Fokker triplane behind it. This is not the same Fokker D7 that was in the pictures previous. This is another one that was built by Cole in the 80s and 90s. It was first flown in 1991, I think, and it's been in our air show ever since. Again, this is a frontline fighter from 1917, 1918 for the Germans in World War I. It was quite effective. These are our rides planes. So this is a new standard in flight, 2 of them actually. This is, you know, if you want to come out and take a biplane ride, this is what we'll go flying in. Next one. Biplane rides. You get a full view of the Hudson Valley. We take you out to the river. You see the bridge. You see the Rokeby Farm. You see the farm right there at the corner of the bridge approach. I can't remember the name. And all the pretty mansions down along the along the waterfront there. And we circle essentially Red Hook down to Rhinebeck. You can see Rhinebeck at the fairgrounds. We'll see a fairground shot coming up. Next one. He's happy. There's the fair from the air. It's always a fun weekend.
So how many passengers can it take?
4 at a time.
Four?
Carry 4 passengers plus the pilot. So, next one. That's our Cauldron G3, which is another one that we hop just down the runway. Always fun to see it kind of levitate off the ground because it's a huge airplane. It's really big. That's an aerial shot of the airfield. Next one. 5 airplanes in the air. This past summer. We put everything up for essentially the final act of the Saturday show and for the bombing raid of the Sunday show. So everything's in formation here, making a circle down the line. So our Fokker D8. You can see the whirring radial engine again, the blur, and the whole engine spinning up in there. Really neat. This was a late comer to the war. Again, didn't actually see any frontline service. It was on the front lines in the last month of the war. They were really kind of starting to dial back the air operations. It would have been a successful airplane if the war had gone on. It would have replaced the Fokker D7 as the frontline Fokker fighter.
Clay, I'm gonna have to,
Oh, we're on the last
Call it a
slide.
night.
I think we're finishing up.
okay?
2 more. Keep going.
This is so interesting.
We'll blast through.
Thank you very much.
Well, you're welcome.
And you've done a remarkable job preserving an important